Well, I'm gonna get started here with doing the intro and introductions, and so everyone, I'm assuming you know who I am. Actually, let's go back. So we have a couple faces that were familiar from yesterday. We have Mike Plunkett, who's president and CEO of Postcom. We have Hamilton, who is president and executive director of ACMA. And new for today's discussion is also Steve Kearney, who is the executive director of Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers. And so one of the things I do want to point out is Quad is a member of each one of these associations, and these associations do important work, not only for Quad, but for Quad's customers, for all of you here in this room. And so despite all the big stuff that we've been talking about over the last day and a half now, there's also a lot of other stuff going on behind the scenes where these associations are fighting for our interests. And what we wanted to do is spend some time talking about all the other things that are going on that are maybe below the surface that you may not be aware of, but are still going to be critically important to what's going on within our businesses and the Postal Service in general. So we've got just a bullet list of topics that we're going to just kind of start walking our way through. And first, we're going to spend some time talking about the regulator, which we haven't done a lot so far at this conference. And I think, Mike, you were going to kick us off here.
Sure. For those who are familiar with our association and some of the work we do, I would say we have generally been an outspoken critic of the Postal Regulatory Commission because I think what they do is incredibly important. The Postal Service is a unique institution in many ways, but one of the most important ways it's unique is it has legally enforceable monopolies, and yet it sets its own prices. That's something that happened because of the Postal Accountability and Enhancement Act. That means the role of the regulator is incredibly important. And one of the things that I have been frustrated by over the last 15 years, which includes the time I was at the Postal Service, is that when the law changed in 2006, it ostensibly changed the role of the regulator and gave them broader authority to actually oversee service and other features of postal performance. They really never adapted. They maintained a very limited role, and they act more or less as a checker of the Postal Service's math, whereas I think there's a much more active role they could play in strengthening the overall system that we all operate in. And so I'm encouraged by a couple of recent developments where I see them becoming more aware of some of the challenges that we all face. But I think historically, I think they can do more, and I think they should do more. And so we spend a lot of our time trying to think of ways and be an active participant in litigation to try to get them to take on a more active and supportive role for our industry.
Yeah, I think from my take on it, the regulator is incredibly important in putting countervailing pressure on a government monopoly. I think we agree in America that an unregulated monopoly without any marketplace forces on it doesn't lead us to a good place, and that's why we have public utility commissions and other, wherever there isn't a monopoly, other groups that push back against that monopoly to make sure that the best interest of the citizen is being represented. And I think, I won't speak for my colleagues here, but I think those of us that are watching the Postal Regulatory Commission have been disappointed that it hasn't been stronger in its approach to getting to root cause issues and making sure that we're all represented in that process. Some people joke that it's become the Mailer Regulatory Commission, not the Postal Regulatory Commission. And they were given a lot of significant additional powers in PAEA, subpoena power. They established a complaint case process. They've never issued a subpoena, to my understanding. I don't think there's ever been a complaint case filed. The process, as Mike said, is a bit broken, and I think we need to have a strong regulator, but we also need to have a regulator that works closely with the Postal Service and the rest of the industry to have good, productive outcomes, and that doesn't always happen. I sometimes feel that we spend a lot of time in this regulatory morass, and we haven't accomplished anything. We've just added more complication and more barriers to getting things done. And we've had some discussions in the industry about how we can change that.
Yeah, I actually had Sharon Owen's job at the Postal Service when we made the transition under PAEA, so I did a few rate cases under the old process, which was about every 3 years based on postal cost. And then we transitioned to the price cap regime with an annual increase based on CPI. And I recently found a PowerPoint presentation I did in that role back in 2007. And we at the Postal Service were very optimistic that this new process and this new regulator were going to really do great things by giving the Postal Service a profit incentive and freedom to set prices as long as you stayed under the cap. And we also committed to working much more with customers in designing our pricing. But the Alliance of Nonprofit Mailers, which has been deeply involved with the Postal Rate Commission and now the Regulatory Commission for over 40 years, have been really disappointed with what's happened in the last about 16 years now that they've become a regulator. I really think they should be able to regulate effectively prices, service, and cost. And really the only thing they have any power over right now or exercise any power is pricing. And you may notice that we question the judgment they use in the way they've regulated pricing with this new setup they have. But even worse, they do virtually nothing to affect the service and the costs at the Postal Service. And we can go into all sorts of examples of that. But the ineffectiveness of the Regulatory Commission is one of the problems right now from a customer perspective about the Postal Service.
I mean, just look at what we don't have. The 2006 law explicitly encouraged innovation by creating new rules for market tests and explicitly endorsing negotiated service agreements. There are 0 negotiated service agreements for market-dominant mail, even though it's still about a $40 billion business.
And there's only been 11 in history.
And the number of market tests is incredibly small over the 15 years since the law passed. And there's a noticeable lack of innovation at the regulator. We still do too much via very contentious paper-based litigation instead of more collaborative conference-type forums in which you could actually share ideas without going through attorneys. Our biggest expense is legal expenses because it is a very labor-intensive and by definition contentious activity that I don't think produces good results for us or the Postal Service. And so I think we all would benefit if we can move the regulator in a more constructive direction.
And what Mike's referring to, I mean, you can't just get the Postal Service and the regulator and the industry in a room together and just talk through an issue. And as a result of that, it's inefficient.
I recently had the chance to hear directly from a senior official who knows what's going on inside the PRC more than I do. And this person said that the real problem is they have a lack of capacity to do the full scope of what they should be doing, and pointed out that since PAEA, their budget has barely increased. I think it was around $15 billion when the law passed, and it's around million, I should say, and it's around 17 million now, and their staff is about 75 people. So they're trying to regulate the Postal Service, which is over $70 billion monopoly, over 600,000 employees serving everybody in the country. So the point was that they need a lot more resources to do this effectively, and they're happy about another provision in the Postal Reform Act that just passed, not noticed by a lot of people, but it changed the budget process for the PRC. So previously, they've had to go to Congress every year to get appropriations approval for their budget, even though the money came from the Postal Service Fund, which is ratepayers' money. Now they just have to go to the Postal Board of Governors and present their budget, and within 30 days, the governors have to decide whether they're going to try to change it or not. So they're probably going to get what they think they need going forward in budgets. They've also started a big data initiative and hired their first chief data officer because they say that they lack the data capabilities to regulate effectively. But again, kind of like Louis DeJoy said the other night, that we might have to wait a couple of years before we see benefits from his efforts. I think the PRC is kind of saying it's going to take us quite a while to build up the capabilities and the capacity to do the job they're supposed to be doing, which is unfortunate because it's already 16 years since the law changed.
So when we look at PAEA versus the new PSRA, is there anything different when it comes to the regulator?
Yes and no. It does require the regulator to take a fresh look at costs, specifically on flats, and to study those. It also it requires more transparency in reporting by the Postal Service, and the PRC has already initiated their own dashboard project, and they recently initiated a new rulemaking to change, or possibly change, how the Postal Service reports on service performance. But as I always have to remind myself, transparency does not immediately lead to improvement. And in many ways, it could just slow the process of improvement down. So
And
I
that's
think
especially a risk on the flats cost study, because as you know and participate in, we're making good progress on that. And now I don't want to see everybody pause and say, well, we'll have the regulator do a study. The regulator's been studying flats costs, what, for 15 years or so, and is not really getting much done there. As a matter of fact, it's just burying everyone with paperwork, additional reporting on the case of the Postal Service, and yet no real value add to any changes. So yeah, I think there is a risk there.
Yeah, the PSRA requires the Postal Service to launch its own dashboard of service for the public to see, and I believe the Postal Regulatory Commission is going to oversee the process of building that dashboard, ensuring that it contains the right information and that it's reliable. But again, as Mike said, transparency is great, but it's only a half measure. I mean, it's one thing to write reports that say you're missing your service goals on this many products. It'd be another thing if they said, if you miss your service goals, you have a penalty. You can raise your rates 1% less next year than you would have. There's never been any downside in the pricing regulation, which is usually the thing that's used when you're regulating monopolies. Give them an upside, but also give them a downside for not meeting the goals and requirements.
So one of the other things I want to make sure everyone's still aware of, obviously when the new rate making decision came out from the regulator that gave the Postal Service the density authority, the retirement authority, and essentially broke the CPI cap, the industry associations came together to take that decision to court. The district court shot it down, essentially. But that is still an ongoing thing, even though it's not really in the headlines anymore. And Steve, I don't know if you want to talk to that.
We've joined with Mike's group at Postcom to file a petition at the Regulatory Commission that they take another look at these new pricing rules, because as they said in their ruling about a year and a half ago, if there were major changes in legislation or other factors that affect the financial stability of the Postal Service, they would take another look. They are committed to taking another look 5 years later, but they said if there were big changes before then, we should take another look. Actually, I think if we had an effective regulator, they would take the initiative to start that on their own. They wouldn't require us to file a petition. Then the Postal Service filed an opposition to our petition saying that it should be thrown out. Then we filed a response to that. And so there's a very expensive process to do everything, when you would think with the passage of this law, the PRC would just say, we're going to take a look at it now.
And while that's going on, while the district court did shoot down our litigation that the regulator overstepped his authority, we are taking that to the Supreme Court with petition for certiorari. I think it's, anytime you go to the Supreme Court, well, first it's a junk ball, but it's also unlikely that they take any case. It's a very high bar. But we're making the point that this is important to us. And so a couple of industry associations are pursuing the petition approach. A couple of others are continuing the litigation approach. And hopefully we get some relief one way or the other.
Yeah. So we're coming at it from multiple angles.
Exactly.
Anywhere and any way we can.
But I want to point out, we are, we partnered with Steve's association to initiate a petition to try to reopen regulations. But this is an example of be careful what you wish for, right? I mean, one of the reasons Postcom did not join the petition for the Supreme Court is because I don't have the exact number, but over about a 4-year period, we spent $1 million as an association just on legal fees associated with the 10-year review of rate regulations, and our board decided we didn't want to throw any more money at that. So if we're successful in our petition, we'll be right back in it again, probably in a multi-year proceeding designed to re-examine the new regulations. I just want to take a second to call out, though, that one of the reasons we think this is important, yes, the circumstances have changed, but it's hard to overstate how bad the density adder is as a form of regulation, because it actually disincentivizes the Postal Service to do anything to try to grow mail. It rewards them if mail volume declines, not just because of external factors like declines in the economy, but if they reduce service standards and volume declines as a result, they're rewarded with additional rate authority. As far as constructive regulation goes, it's hard to do worse than the density adder.
Lose business and generally lose volume, and generally businesses reduce price, not increase them.
Right.
Also, during that 4+ year process, the PRC threw out there a proposed additional adder, which was based on performance relative to service and productivity goals. But it was all upside for the Postal Service. If they made their own goals, they could raise rates even more. And we and others pointed out the fallacy of that, the problems with that. So they set aside the whole look at performance and committed to come back to that later. So that's another expensive process we will probably have to go through. And the fact that they only had upside for meeting your own goals, and they also have upside for lowering volume in mail, shows that this is not a very well-informed regulator.
Right. Well, and to also point out the fact that, we've been talking about volume, but, yes, they talk about the additional cost of the additional delivery points. And even though volume did grow over this past year, because of that calculation, they still got an additional density authority, even though volume did grow.
And it's, I could bash the PRC all day.
Could you?
Yeah, I could. And
I guess we've covered the last item on there already, huh?
So, and if you think about it, that adjustment for growth in delivery points, intuitively, it makes sense. But there's no discrimination between entirely new extensions of delivery routes where there is actual additional line of travel, or just new delivery points within an existing route, which have very different cost characteristics. Nor does it recognize the fact that the vast majority of new delivery points are cluster boxes. There's no more door delivery, there's no more curb line delivery really, and so newer delivery points are not as expensive as the ones that are in the existing network, and the regulator does not even have the technical wherewithal to take those things into account. It's truly disappointing, and I want to, in the interest of being fair, point out these are all, I know all 5 of the regulators. They're very smart and I think well-intentioned individuals, but they're politicians. Their backgrounds are not in economics or regulatory affairs. They're Hill staffers. And they do not necessarily have the background you would like to have in people making such momentous decisions.
So I know we've kind of touched on it, but just to actually talk about the annual compliance determination. So that's an annual event, and it's become more and more important now since the change with the additional adders, because essentially with the issuing of the annual compliance determination also grants the Postal Service the additional rate authorities for density and for retirement. But to talk about the actual annual compliance determination, because that's a new thing that went in, back in 2006, and from my perspective, it doesn't amount to much beyond wagging a finger.
It satisfies a legal requirement. One of the important functions of the regulator is to determine that the Postal Service's rates are in compliance with the law. And so the annual compliance determination does serve that really important function. But Bob, you're absolutely correct. In terms of driving improvements, we have greatly reduced the time and effort we spend commenting on the annual compliance report because it doesn't generate positive outcomes. It really does amount to checking a box that they've done their work.
Yeah, if I could jump in on that. I think a lot of us have spent a lot of energy in chewing through the information the Postal Service releases in their annual compliance report, and then commenting to the PRC for input that we hope they'll adopt in their determination. And I think all of us have raised some really important and meaty issues, only to have them just summarily dismissed with one sentence by the regulator. And at some point you just say, we're clearly not having an impact here. It's not worth the time and effort. And so I think the importance of what was set up to be a good catch-all in the regulatory process never worked the way we intended.
Yeah, to your point, Bob, if you read that thing, it's really stark to me, the difference between pricing and cost and service. Pricing, they say, yes, you can go ahead and raise rates 6.5 for these classes and 8.5 for those. Service, they say, you missed your service goals on these 15 products. So work on that and do a better job and do some studies, and we're going to keep watching you. And cost, you didn't cover the costs on these products. So some of them you're required to raise their rates more than average because of that. And work on the cost, do some more studies, and we'll keep an eye on the costs. And they've been saying that over and over again now for 15 years. At some point, the Postal Service realizes there's no
teeth.
There's no accountability for either service or cost, but there is very specific authority to raise rates.
So does anyone have any questions on anything that we touched on?
Okay, so you indicated that the USPS is a monopoly. But on the package side, they've got the pressure from USPS, or U.S. Postal Service, UPS, there we go, UPS and FedEx. So isn't the kind of the monopoly portion really what we're all worried about is the mail? Why can't they focus there? They already have a relationship with UPS, with the SurePost. I would kind of think, let's start one place, get that perfected, then move on. Like, get down letters and flats, then we'll let you play with packages? Or is that not illogical?
A couple things. The Postal Service plays a very important role in the package delivery market. If you looked at package delivery rates for items weighing less than 70 pounds, they are much lower when you account for changes in weight than anything above that level, because 70 pounds is the maximum limit for the Postal Service to deliver things. They act as a real a low-cost provider, which exerts significant market pressure on UPS and FedEx to maintain reasonable prices. The value to the U.S. public and small businesses especially of the Postal Service being in that market is substantial. It's probably billions, if not trillions of dollars a year. So their presence in the package delivery market confers real consumer benefits on the entire country. And I would not want to lose sight of that. So there is a very important role for them in the package business. And of course, as we all know, package volume is growing significantly, whereas mail volume has been steadily but slowly declining. So there's a real role for them in that market.
And they're also really the only one that's going to every address every day. And UPS and FedEx put retail and home delivery, non-business delivery surcharges on, and really are not interested in especially some of the most unprofitable routes in rural America. The other piece of this is the Postal Service is the shipper of last resort. You'll notice this last peak season when FedEx and UPS started curtailing the volumes that they would accept from you all. The Postal Service did not do that, and so they really provide, in many respects, a safety valve to getting goods through in peak times.
Any other questions? The group? Oh, so we can get it
I
recorded.
knew Phil would have a question.
As long as it's not for me.
So
Yeah.
looking down the road after this 5-year program with the PRC, looking down the road, is this the new rate-making process? I mean, up to now, I'm assuming that this is a one-off, and then we're going to suffer through this, appreciating, the efforts that are ongoing through the courts to try to mitigate our problem, but the courts are basically saying, well, you're the regulator, we don't know how to tell you what to do, so we're going to accept, your authority. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing that, but if that's so, let me know. So looking down the road, if things continue to be problematic with the Postal Service, are we going to just see perpetual? We've already seen that the PRC went through 3 iterations and got better and better at moving off of a fixed percentage and then created a flex in the density factor, right? Which is more of a exigent circumstance. Is this the game that we're playing from now on? Is that the new rate-making process where we're going to wait and see? We're not getting, from the PRC saying, we're not going to get rid of the price cap, we're just going to stack something on top of it. So the price cap we're not breaking the price cap model, but they are.
So I guess I'll take an initial shot at answering this, and then you guys can jump in. But in the petition that was filed for the PRC to re-review, now in light of PSRA being passed, the specific ask was the density and retirement factors be removed, and we go back to CPI only. So ultimately, I think that's what we as an industry would like to try and get to. Now, the thing to keep in mind is even if the PRC does choose to pick up that petition and do it, remember their last 10-year review took 4 years. So that still means it could be a 4-year process starting now before we get rid of density, even if we were successful getting rid of density and retirement. But granted, didn't they say retirement goes away automatically after 5 years?
Yeah.
So that's my answer, but.
Yeah, I think a lot depends, Phil, on how well the Postal Service does with packages. I mean, nonprofits don't mail a lot of packages, but we certainly want the Postal Service to succeed on the package side. And I think that's what the Postmaster General was saying the other night. If he gets to the efficiency and profitability, and he sees most of the opportunity on the package side, then all of us will benefit. Our rates won't have to go up anymore in the best possible world.
And at the risk of damaging my reputation as being inherently cynical, I do think there's the possibility that the PRC went a little too far, and they realized that. I think when they put their new regulations in place, I don't think in any way did they envision that the Postal Service would start raising prices twice a year and essentially duplicating that extra 2% on the non-compensatory products. I also think they underestimated the extent to which the governors would authorize the Postal Service to take every available cent, even when they're sitting on $25 billion in cash, raising prices the exact same day that the president signed into law a bill that gives them $100 billion over 10 years. I don't think the PRC ever would have expected that. But what that tells me is they thought their regulations were great until the humans running the monopolies, so they're supposed to regulate, reacted rationally in response to the new incentives they created. So I would not be surprised if they pulled back a little bit somehow. How they'll do that, I don't know.
Okay, gonna move on to some topics regarding the Postal Service. First thing we wanted to do is ask you guys. So we had the PMG here on Tuesday evening. What did you think of the message? Well,
Got to stop complaining. Moving forward.
any others? Any thoughts from here? I know some of us have heard something very similar to what he delivered.
Yeah, you know, like your boss said, he's saying a lot of the right things, and he's probably the first PMG we've known who openly admits the efficiencies and the excess costs that need to be taken care of. But I am a little cynical like Mike, or skeptical, and let me just tell you part of my bias. I worked at the Postal Service for 9 Postmasters General, and 4 of them were businessmen from the business world who came in and were going to fix things and make things better. And they actually came in during the 80s and 90s when mail volume was growing at a record pace. And the first one, Al Casey, stayed about 8 months. Second one, Bob Tisch, stayed about 2 years. Third one, Tony Frank, stayed about 4 years, and Marvin Runyon stayed about 6 years. And I think they all came in thinking they could apply their business savvy to the Postal Service and run it like a business. And I think what they found was that while certain aspects of the Postal Service can be run like a business and efficiently, there are these external pressures that no private sector business has, primarily coming from Congress and from the unions. So my concern is that while Mr. DeJoy has the right idea and he's done some of this stuff in the private sector at his previous companies, he hasn't, and he has already experienced pushback on things he's tried to do. But when he starts trying to take jobs out and close facilities and post offices, he's in for another experience, I think. And I don't think it's that the previous PMGs were not as smart as him or didn't understand what was wrong with the network or what these excess expenses were. I think it's because they reacted to the pressure they got not to do the fully business-like thing. The bottom line is what we have here now is an experiment with really trying to run the Postal Service as a business, taking it to its logical conclusion. And we're going to sit back in the coming months, or not sit back, but we're going to observe whether that really can be done or not.
Yeah, I think that maybe what is different here than the other outside PMGs you've talked about is this PMG has really partnered with his management team to make some changes. And some of the other PMGs that at least I'm familiar with got a lot of pushback internally and didn't really ever get true partnership across the workforce. So I'm hopeful. I think we have to watch and see how things roll out and look for some signals that this is ultimately going to be successful.
I like a lot of the things the PMG said, and I think this is the 5th or 6th time I've seen him in front of a group like this. And his message, I think, is evolving, and I think it's important for us all to remember. He came in a couple years ago in the middle of a pandemic, and so for over a year, he really had no opportunity to interact with people like you. And so his learning curve initially was all based on internal information to the Postal Service. I think I've observed that as he has gotten out more, now that he's able to go out and meet with groups like this, his thinking does seem to be evolving. And I think the more he does that, I think the more he'll be able to take a more holistic view of the system than I think was possible for him, given the circumstances under which he entered his position. And it is a really difficult job. Somebody called it thankless, arguably the most thankless job.
It may be
in
one
the
of the
US.
hardest jobs
Yeah,
in Washington.
it is.
It is a tough job. I would like to talk about the customer piece of this, though. I think you heard him talk about getting criticism and not getting input in his 10-year strategic marketing plan. And at least by my standards, I've never done a strategic marketing plan except talking to my customers and talking to the market. And that's really the first step. And I'd like to compare and contrast Jeff's last session, talking and interacting with Quad customers versus the interaction we have as customers with the Postal Service. You just don't have the same level of transparency and disclosure, save the flats work that we've done. For the most part, it's coming up with solutions and policy and direction, throwing it over the transom to industry and having us react to it. And it would be really nice in a tightly integrated supply chain. You know, if you're at the beginning of the supply chain, I'm behind you, and you're gonna make a hard left turn, for God's sakes, put your turn signal on. And let me know what's happening, right? And because it takes us all time to adjust to this sort of thing. A great example of this is the Federal Register notice process, which I have successfully gotten 3 PMGs to agree on, that they would keep faith with the concept that before they start publishing changes to policy, they circulated amongst some of the industry to let us give them some feedback about where we think it may be able to be improved. Instead, what happens is they publish it, and then we all provide the feedback, and then, I don't know about this postal management regime, but in previous regimes, they get all upset with us when we cloud up and rain on what they're planning to do. But what they were planning to do could have been improved had they co-created with us. So you saw with Jeff a lot of co-creation of solutions with Quad customers. I'd love to see that co-creation of solutions with the mailing industry. And yes, it does take a little more time. Every time you involve a broader group, there's more complexity. But I'm reminded of the study that Ford did of 2 teams with exactly identical tasks. The first team took a long time to implement. They spent a long time planning, and then they implemented. The second team, who was they were both incented to get done as quickly as possible, did some planning and then jumped right into implementation, and then got a little bit into implementation and realized they needed to do more planning. And they then did replanning and then more implementation. The first team was a lot faster in completion of tasks than the second team. And that's the nature of the beast, especially in a tightly integrated supply chain.
All right. So I want to talk a little bit about the Postal Service Board of Governors. They come up in conversation. Right now, there's 2 vacancies. One vacancy, but that candidate has been cleared out of subcommittee but not voted on by the Senate, right?
There are 2 pending nominees to the Board of Governors. They both had hearings before the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee in the Senate, and they were approved by the committee. They're just awaiting a Senate vote. That is a formality. There's no reason to think they won't be confirmed and sit on the Board of Governors. The Board of Governors is meeting right now, for those who aren't aware, but those 2 new gentlemen, both of whom have excellent backgrounds and are eminently qualified to be governors, they won't be participating today, but this is probably the last meeting with the current composition of the governors.
So I know there's a lot of politics in DC. Once those 2 get confirmed, the Biden appointees will have a majority on the board. Does that mean anything?
I don't think it means a lot. I had a lot of interaction with the governors when I was there, and the 5-4 partisan split never really meant much when I was there. I know a lot has been made of it in the past couple of years, but really the governors get into the business of running the business rather than going in there with an agenda to fire somebody or do anything major. We also have to remember that governors are appointed by the president, confirmed by the Senate, but it's a very part-time job. They meet a couple days a month. And so some of the more active governors are in constant contact with the PMG, but a lot of them attend these monthly meetings, and that's most of their involvement. And they mostly, like a lot of corporate boards, listen to what management is proposing, and if it sounds reasonable, approve it if they need to approve it. And really the main two things governors approve is rate changes and the hiring and firing of the Postmaster General. And for them to fire a Postmaster General, it would take something huge to do that, like criminal charges or something like that. So they're not going to get together just because there's now a majority of Biden appointees and do anything major. It's going to be a much more evolutionary process. And what Mike mentioned, having really good candidates join, is the most important thing to help the Postal Service continuously improve.
Asking the right questions in board meetings.
I want to disagree a little bit. I think Steve's absolutely correct. You're not going to notice anything different with the new governors. But I think there are two things to keep in mind. At their hearing, both governors were asked about the Postal Service's vehicle fleet purchase. Postal Service has already been sued by 16 states and a couple of NGOs. And at a recent hearing in the House, one of the legislators, I don't remember who she was, indicated that the federal government is likely to sue the Postal Service over their vehicle acquisition. So I think you'll probably see a little more scrutiny over the Postal Service's fleet purchase. Another thing that isn't on the horizon yet, but Postmaster General DeJoy has been in the job 2 years now. Typical tenure for PMG is about 3 years. And while I don't see any signs that he's planning to leave, it's very possible that the next group of governors is going to be the one that picks the next PMG. So the fact that you have a majority nominated by President Biden might make a difference when it comes to choosing who that person is.
Okay. So one of the things that's also happened relatively recently is the PMG updated his 10-year plan. Any initial impressions of it?
What's the policy on foul language in the, no, sorry. I think we're all waiting to see what happens next, right? The easy part is done. Although the PMG deserves credit, I cannot think of another PMG in my tenure in this industry who could have gotten that legislation across the finish line. I think
He put a lot of work into that. Yeah.
Yes.
As did the governors.
Yes.
Who are also politically connected.
So that was an achievement. The raising prices, that's pretty easy. The hard part is about to begin, and I think Steve touched on it before. When it gets to taking out costs and making hard decisions about the network, it won't be as easy, and he'll face obstruction and challenges from the unions and from the Hill, and that's we'll have to wait and see, I think.
Okay.
You know, while we're on that, there's also some things that weren't done in legislation. And I don't know if you're getting to that on the next slide, or we should do that here.
I'm not remembering if it's on other topics, but sure, jump into it.
You know, the PRA, Postal Service Reform Act, is great progress, and there was a lot of people that worked on it, mainly industry coalitions. A lot of you all got active when we asked you to. Pat talked about getting consumers activated. That made a big difference. We need to educate members of Congress that they can't do postal legislation every 15 years. They have to do it more frequently. Technology and communications are changing at a rapid rate, as you're well aware, and there's going to be tune-ups that are required. There's also gaps that weren't in the legislation. For instance, all the money that we give them, they have about $300 billion of your money over to pay future retiree and health benefits. Those are all over at Treasury getting a princely return of 2%. if your pension was getting a 2% return, how happy would you be? So they really need to have a reasonable return, market rate of return on the invested assets. That's going to take an act of Congress to get done. So there's work to be done, and I would just ask all of you to stay engaged with your member of Congress, build a relationship. We're going to need your voice. As a constituent, you have such power that none of the rest of us do have, because we're not constituents. And it really takes that relationship, and it's not just postal. We've got sales tax legislation we need to do, privacy. How would you like to wake up and have 50 different privacy standards that you have to adhere to? Extra-jurisdictional regulation, the use of sales tax to put other tax liabilities on your business. So there's a lot coming down the pike, and it's time for us to all continue to pay attention to what's happening and be active in the process.
All right, so service standards and performance. There's been a series, I believe 3 now, changes made to service standards, changes and or proposed changes. So there was the first class mail service standard change. Then there was the first class packages. Well, the first class service standard one also impacted periodicals. Then there was the packages one that just went into effect. Now we received another notice where there's a proposal to change the CET for periodicals to 8 a.m. Do we think this is the end of it? First question is, do we think this is the end of it? And the other thing is, given the fact that the regulator can only issue an advisory opinion, and each one of those have been flat out ignored, what is the point of the regulator?
That's a loaded question. Yeah. It is a glaring weakness in the regulation that, again, a regulated monopoly has sort of unilateral authority to modify terms of service, which are in effect price increases. When you reduce the quality, it is analogous to raising rates, and yet there is no authority conferred on the regulator to prevent that. That's the thing about a lot of the way the regulation works. It kind of assumes that the monopoly will act in the best interest of everybody, but that's not a rational expectation, right? You should expect the monopolist to act in the interest of the monopolist. And the service standards changes are a really good example of that, that there is a glaring hole in the regulation of the system.
Yeah, and the first class mail slowdown of about 39%, I think. Some of the commissioners at the PRC wrote their own separate opinions, even being more negative about it, including the chairman saying it's a minuscule amount of savings for a big change in service. So it's another, as Mike says, glaring example of the ineffectiveness of the regulator. It's also kind of, if you're going to work on improving meeting your standards, it's not really a good idea to publicly move the goalposts as your first move, and then say later we'll try to be efficient and meet the closer goalpost.
All right. So this last item, future price increases. I think we've spent enough time at this conference already covering that topic. I think we know what's probably coming at us. We talked about that a little bit yesterday. So going on to other topics that are, I guess I should open up any other Postal Service related questions from the audience that are things that you would like to ask about. Okay, so we have just a handful of other topics to touch on. I think we already
covered the first
did.
one.
Yeah, the Supreme Court appeal, which is really at this point, it's the legal work has been done that can be done now, and it's just really waiting to see if the Supreme Court chooses to pick up the case or not.
Yeah, and we've got an interesting twist on how we've asked it, so I won't go into all the detail, but we'll see what happens.
Okay. We talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to maybe dive into it a little bit more because there's been a fair amount of discussion about dashboards, and want to just raise the awareness here with this group.
It'll be interesting to watch. The new law requires the Postal Service to have a dashboard that displays service performance. in a more granular fashion than is available today. And there's a role for the PRC to determine what needs to be on there, and there'll be an opportunity for public comment. But before the law passed, the PRC was already developing their own dashboard. And the Postal Service has filed something with the PRC saying, let's work together. We don't want to confuse the public by having multiple dashboards that purport to do the same thing. I have a suspicion the PRC is going to just continue to work on their own, and that it won't necessarily be identical. And I think that's okay. I think consumers are smart enough to handle multiple sources of information. And I think the regulators shouldn't necessarily just repeat what the Postal Service says, and they have an active role to play in service measurement. So I hope they pursue it.
The Inspector General's built a dashboard as well.
Yeah, well, my sense is that dashboards will be important to households and consumers who are living in a world of rumors and innuendo about how long mail takes to be delivered, and it might help restore their confidence. Our members who are professional mailers have not been beating down the door asking for a dashboard from the Postal Service. They generally focus on their own mail and do their own measurement with their service providers, so I don't think it's a big improvement for mailers, but there's an idea, I think, on the Hill that more visibility will actually improve service.
So one question I have, you know, one of the things we've been living with, I would say up until now, is that, you know, the Postal Service would always report essentially percent on time. Well, obviously now with 3 changes to the service standard, the bar has changed, so percent on time is fluid as far as what does it really mean. One of the things that's happened now is the Postal Service has started picking up on a new term called days to deliver. Is that a better measurement in your guys' opinion?
Average days to deliver.
Yeah, sorry.
I think there are known problems with averages, and I think that's the problem here, that if my mail is out here on the tail of the bell-shaped curve, I don't care what the average is. Certainly if you brought the whole curve together and there was less tail, then the average might mean a bit more. But as long as there's a big tail, I think it's actually a misleading way to describe your service.
Well, you really have to look at both, the average and the tail, and then I think you do have a much more comprehensive
I think
view.
I actually like average days to deliver better than percent on time because it's less prone to manipulation by, for example, changing the standards. On the other hand, I think Steve and Hamilton both got their finger on it. Any indicator, if it is not, does not include contextual information to help you understand whether something is good or not, isn't really very helpful. So is 2.7 average days to deliver first-class mail good? I don't know. If all of that mail is being entered at a delivery unit, 2.7 days is terrible. If it's all going from Maine to Southern California, 2.7 days would be an incredible achievement. And so what I hope the PRC eventually figures out is you've got to put that information into context for it to have any meaning to the people that are consuming it. And that's something that I think has always been a relative weakness of the way service gets talked about.
Okay. Future legislation, we've touched on it. Maybe my question there is, you know, we've touched on a number of different topics that could be part of future legislation. What item do you think has the highest likelihood of being at least picked up? Not that it's going to be successful, but actually get some attention in
But just
Congress.
let me set the table with some of the things that might be on future
Okay.
legislation. We've talked about our frustration with the regulator. That is a legislative fix. Strengthen the regulator and make it truly an effective regulator that provides some countervailing force against a government monopoly. And there's a bunch of details under how that could be done. We have talked about the poor investment return on the monies invested. That has to be done congressionally. There could be some limited refunds for failure to meet service obligations that could be put into the law. The private statutes is part of the 2 monopolies that the Postal Service has. Maybe it's advisable to start looking at those and relaxing those in certain circumstances. The pay and benefits compatibility with the private sector is something that Congress has historically not wanted to do. I think there's still some question around that. It's interesting, this Postmaster General has decided not to take on labor, which I think actually was absolutely the right decision. Labor was necessary to get the Postal Reform Act passed. It's also very clear when a PMG comes in, starts busting up all sorts of things, including labor, it gets a lot of work action and pushback that ultimately undermines what he's trying to do. So, and in my experience in getting organizational change, you've got to bring your labor force in the process and get them engaged, and he has done that. So I think that's a great move. But I think at some point we're going to need to understand that we're paying the appropriate amount, not overpaying, not underpaying, and I think he's got to get to the point where he needs fewer people, and then that's going to be a real inflection point in terms of whether or not he's absolutely able to get rid of some of those costs. While we're on costs, how about all these legacy costs? Who pays for them? Are those to our account, those public costs? One of the issues is this universal service obligation has a public benefit, but is being paid only by ratepayers. And I don't think that's sustainable in a declining middle environment. At some point, the government may need to write a check to allow every address in America to get 6 days of delivery, because we're not going to be able to write that check. And if the regulator or the Postal Service tries to put that cost on us, then we're just going to get out of the mail even faster than we are already. So I think the whole USO, who pays for the USO, who pays for the legacy costs, all of those could be elements for future regulation, or future legislation, excuse me.
I think that's the big thing that needs to be done. We need to accurately measure what the net cost of the universal service obligation is as the value of the monopoly goes down, as the cost of all the extra non-business things the Postal Service has to do goes up. That's a huge, the industry, including Pat, just spent 11 years getting the $5.5 billion payment obligation off the books for refunding. Well, I think the USO is costing at least $5 billion a year. So if we're going to operate like this as a business and compete with FedEx and UPS and everybody else, how can we compete with an extra $5 billion or more on the books? For 200 years, up until 1980, the government paid a subsidy every year to the post office or postal service. It was the 1970 Act that said we're going to take that away, and by 1980 it was gone. And I'm really concerned about whether the Postal Service can compete as a business, assuming that we mailers and shippers are going to pay this extra cost that all the businesses we're competing with don't have to pay.
This is a good reminder of what an outlier the U.S. Postal Service really is, because almost every other post on Earth has already reckoned with this challenge. They almost always have some universal service provision written into their law, and the U.S. is really the only advanced economic country in the world that operates a exclusive government monopoly with no provision for public funding of universal service. So it's hard to believe that can sustain forever. It's just really, I think, a matter of time before that has to get addressed.
Okay, and I know we're slightly over, but Lisa gave me the okay to go on. So why don't we do any final thoughts or anything else that we haven't brought up that you maybe wanted to touch on? Just go down.
I think we've covered a lot of territory. I do think, a lot of focus on the rate increases. That's going to be a continued area of focus for our association, probably job number one for as long as I can see. But one of the reasons that's so important is because we all want the same thing. We all want a healthy network. We disagree sometimes with the Postal Service on the best way to achieve that, and rates is a common point of contest. But we're all here because there's still tremendous value in the system, and it's incumbent on all of us to figure out the best way to maintain that.
Yeah, nonprofits really love the mail. A lot of them have built their entire business model around mail, or a big part of it. So we continue to work to make mail accessible and affordable and reliable to them. And rates, as Mike says, is job one right now. We'd rather it would be something else, but that's what it is. So we'll continue to do that. But I keep going back to, I'm not sure there's run it like a business with no payment for the USO model is going to work long term. And right now, I have the feeling it depends on one guy, Louis DeJoy. And there used to be a theory back in the 1800s of the great man. That's what they called it. I apologize to the women here, but that's been debunked over and over again, that one person cannot turn a company or an organization around. Although in the tech industry, people continue to go back to it, like Elon Musk now is the current great man who's going to help Twitter, just like he helped, or he created SpaceX and Tesla. But there's a lot of evidence that he did that with government help, with the help of thousands of excellent engineers and other people. Another example was Steve Jobs. He didn't invent any of the products. He piggybacked on stuff that the government and other people did. And I don't want the future of the Postal Service to depend on one guy being a great man and leading us into a great future. I think we need true structural reform of the entire funding model for the Postal Service.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. I am hopeful that we're headed in the right direction. Price is critical to us in the catalog industry. It's an input to our circulation decision-making. And we find great value in the mail, as has been said elsewhere. And we want to continue to mail. We want to continue to generate package shipments because we spend 80 cents for every dollar we spend in postage. We've been spending outbound package shipments. And we need this to be a very successful system. And we need to continue to improve our functioning around communication, execution. And I know that, you know, at Quad, for instance, you focus on that all the time, and it really, truly is a daily task. And I would just say it's time for all of us to make sure we don't take our eye off this ball, because there's a lot of opportunity here. As you've heard, there's a lot of downside, and we all need it. So.
All right, well, help me thank our panelists. They do important work for all of us. And I believe next up we have Lisa, who's going to be giving us an MTAC update.